Good day, everyone. I am Karen Bonadio, Director of Alumni Relations, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar to honor your reunion. While we cannot meet in person, technology allows us to convene virtually, and we appreciate your patience as we navigate this event remotely, and apologize in advance for any technical issues you may experience. This webinar is being recorded and closed captioning is available and can be turned on at the bottom of your screen. Today, I'm happy to introduce Ron Heifetz, King Hussein bin Talal Senior Lecturer in Public Leadership for this keynote session.
Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to get to be with you. I sure wish that I could see you in person and shake your hands and find out how you are. But we'll have to wait till next year or sometime in the next years to get to do that again. But I'm really, really glad that the technology enables us at least to touch bases. It's such an extraordinarily stressful time for all of us. And we're seeing, I think, looking around us, we're seeing an extraordinarily large number of examples of successful adaptations to the current crisis and people struggling and with making any kind of adaptation to the current crisis. There are so many different kinds of adaptations going on at the most micro level of people in their own individual lives, and then at every level of any organizational system into people's family and social networks, into people's organizations they're part of. Certainly for those of us teaching this year, it's an enormous set of adaptive challenges facing the students as they have had to give up their spring, that wonderful spring that all of you must remember as the year came to a close, but you got to stay up late sitting in cafes or coffee shops or bars talking till all hours of the night and spend a lot more time outside, and then the excitement of commencement. All of our students have lost that opportunity, lost so much of that. So people have had to make, all of us have had to make extraordinary adaptations to just sustain ourselves over these last months. And I'd like to begin there. I'd like to really begin at that most personal level of adaptability that we're all called upon to do. It seems to me that these crises, all crises, come in phases. This particular crisis has a very, very long acute emergency phase. That is, a lot of crises have a short acute emergency phase where you stabilize the situation, and then you can begin to address the underlying problems that the crisis reveals. Because frequently crises, particularly repeated crises, are an example of underlying challenges facing communities or societies or organizations that haven't been addressed very well in the past, and then it highlights those underlying challenges, and then once one has stabilized the situation and made it through the acute phase, one can begin to then name and work on the underlying challenges. As some of you know, I started my career in medicine, and the emergency room is supposed to stabilize the patient so that then you can begin working on the underlying challenges that caused the initial emergency in the first place. This crisis is different because it's going to have a very prolonged acute emergency phase. We're not going to stabilize the situation very quickly. It could be 6 months, it could be 12 months, it could be 18 months before we have a vaccine that is widely distributed, widely produced, widely available, and that actually enables people to fully return to normal social interaction. So this is a crisis with the characteristic of a prolonged acute emergency phase. Before we can even really work very well the underlying challenges that are revealed in it. the underlying challenges like inequity. It's revealing all sorts of challenges of inequity, where certain populations are much more vulnerable than others, where certain children in certain kinds of schools, certain demographics are much more vulnerable than others, where certain people have better access to healthcare system than others, where people living in slums and high dense populations or migrant workers are much more vulnerable than others. So, you know, we're seeing all sorts of underlying challenges that many of us have known have been there already, but they're being highlighted and surfaced in a way that makes them more dramatic. And the opportunity, I think, through this acute emergency phase let's say that it's going to be a full year. The opportunity for this year, until we all have a vaccine, is for us to capture lessons from all of the successful adaptations and the failed efforts to provide leadership to mobilize the proper kinds of adaptive responses. If we can begin to capture lessons from all those examples of successful and unsuccessful adaptation, successful leadership and unsuccessful leadership in mobilizing adaptation, we might have all sorts of new tools and metaphors and examples to then apply to a whole host of other kinds of challenges facing the world. One of the characteristics of adaptive challenges is that they can't frequently be solved. They can't generally be solved by simply turning to experts for a solution. There are problems that have technical components that require experts to apply their best expertise. We're certainly seeing that in organizations, governments, scientists doing the very best they can to buffer the pain, stabilize our economic situation, and to try to reduce the casualty rate and come up with a cure. But another aspect of this crisis is that doesn't solve the whole problem. The adaptations required to even stabilize the situation require massively distributed behavioral change, where literally every single person on the globe, 6-7 billion people, all have to take some responsibility to change some dimensions of their lives and to adapt to a situation where they can't continue business as usual. So that property of adaptive work, in which authorities can solve part of the problem, the technical parts, but part of the problem requires the development of new capacity in people on a massive distributed scale of responsibility taking. That property of adaptive work, where the work needs to be shared, where it's collective in its nature, is illustrated in this crisis right now. And in that sense, then, it becomes a profound learning moment for everyone around the world, because now we have a common reference point, a common example. Everybody is living through this together all around the globe. And so now to be able to persuade people that to tackle a problem like climate change requires widely distributed responsibility and behavioral change at the most micro level of each of our own individual habits of consumption and work. We can illustrate it now. It's not an abstraction to talk about that adaptive work requires distributed responsibility. People have lived it, and that potentially can provide an enormous tool for leadership post-crisis in tackling problems like climate change or inequity and so forth. A whole host of public problems requires massively distributed responsibility. So the first suggestion I have in terms of maintaining our sense of resilience is to not forget what you learned when you were students, which is how to be a student. And when you were students, some of you struggled over the course of the year. I remember those. I've lived through those struggles with some of you, where it's very hard to stop being your professional and to really give yourself, it was hard for you to give yourself the freedom the luxury, actually, of just being a student where the only job you had to do was to learn. You didn't have to teach other people. You didn't have to advocate. You didn't have to promote. All you had to do was to learn. And that ability then to put back on the learning cap and be in the role of sponge, of observer, of gatherer of information, of looking around the environment and interrogating the environment, exploring the environment for things you could learn that you could then apply to the kinds of problems you care about. That practice that you developed when you were a student at the Kennedy School, I would hope that you can reawaken that you can strengthen that you can anchor yourself in that once again. Because I do think that if you can move through this next year of crisis with all of its devastating impact to many of us in our personal lives, where we're losing loved ones who we can't even say goodbye to, you know, where the adaptations that we've had to make in our lives are profound. If we can, at the same time, be on the dance floor of action where we're engaging in our lives, in our organizations, in our families, with our friends, in making those adaptations, and at the same time get on the balcony to reflect on what's happening to us, what's happening to people around us, where we can get on the balcony and be, again, the learner, the observer of the world around us. I think if we can move through this next year capturing lessons to be applied post-crisis to all of the kinds of adaptive challenges facing our communities, our organizations, our families, from the most micro again to the most macro in a global sense, we will have made really, really good use of this extraordinary global experience. So that's the first thing. I think one way we maintain our own resilience is to anchor ourselves in our ability to reflect in real time on what's happening to us and to capture lessons for the future. In a sense, to anchor ourselves in our larger senses of purpose, in the meaning of it all, you know, and as a learner, to be finding lessons that are consonant with the purposes that matter to you so deeply, that you will continue to work maybe half-time, quarter-time during this crisis. Some of you more than that, but many of you only part-time because the crisis is preoccupying. But at some point you will want to return to those purposes and anchoring yourself in those sources of meaning, in those sources of purpose, and then using this crisis as a means to strengthen your playbook, your caseload, your repertoire of illustrations, of metaphors, of examples that will then be applicable to the issues you care about post-crisis, I think is one really critical way to sustain yourself. But then I think there are other very important ways to sustain yourself that are much closer to home. For me and my wife, we came out at spring break to an apartment that we just had purchased in January out on the big island of Hawaii. So I'm speaking to you right now from Hawaii. And it's just morning here, 10:15 in the morning. And on the one hand, I feel enormously lucky that we're here in a rural environment where the weather is good and where it's very easy to take long walks each day without having to be under an obstacle course. It's very easy to walk, to take long walks and to stay healthy physically. And at our age, that's important. But at the same time, like all of you, we are isolated. And we noticed over the course of the this initial phase of this acute phase, because I think we could begin to divide this prolonged acute phase into subphases. The first subphase was scrambling to figure out how we're going to stock our house to minimize the number of trips to the market, to minimize the exposure and risk to ourselves. And that took about a month of figuring out how we simply going to feed ourselves and secure our lives and our health for what might be a long term, what might be many, many months of isolation. And as we moved through that first month, we felt increasingly stressed, because every time we went to the market, you know, okay, I guess we need to wear masks. Okay, I guess we need to wear gloves. Now, what are we going to do with this food? And how are we going to, you know, what do we need to disinfect it? And all of those questions turned what would frequently be kind of a pleasant trip to the market together into this enormously stressful experience of confronting death, this invisible death with every leaf of lettuce. And it was, kind of crazy making and increasingly stressful. And of course, we would be watching the news a lot to find out what's happening around the world, what's happening in different communities, and how are people managing as they moved up towards the peak. Were they succeeding in flattening the curve? What were our politicians doing? And so after a month of living this way, we began to feel so stressed, we weren't sleeping, that my wife, Catherine, said to me, you know, Ronnie, we need to deliberately manage the stress of our lives. And so we sat down and she said, we need a plan to deal with the stress, because this is a marathon, not a sprint. And we need to figure out how we're going to sustain this over time, because we just can't keep going this way. So, you know, we came up with a structure, and that's my second idea. I think there are resourceful structures that help us buffer the stress and reduce the stress, and that become it becomes a form of an anchor to keep us from getting swept away every day in the current news, the current anxiety, the next issue to tackle. So we began to create structures, you know, and for us, you know, a set bedtime, a set wake up time, a morning walk for an hour as soon as we wake up, time for having breakfast together, and then work time, you know, for me from 10 to 6 work time, and then I'd work. And then another piece of structure for us was no TV news in the evening, because watching TV news in the evening meant we couldn't sleep. It was just too anxiety provoking. So we would get our news during the day, either online by reading or by sometimes turning on the TV and watching the news hour or other news programs to get a sense of how different people are interpreting the reality. Those structures have really helped. They've really anchored us. The practice of daily exercise has been a critical anchoring. Just getting fresh air has been a critical anchoring. Another source of resilience is people. People need people. We need people. And what a blessing that we have this technology. 20 years ago, had we been in this crisis, we would truly be isolated in our homes with telephones, landlines, perhaps, is the most we could do. But now with this technology at free, we can talk to families. And it's important, I'm sure many of you have been drawing on the technology, the regularization of connection with people and coming up with creative ways of being with people is also critically important. A second major source of anchoring are partnerships, people, and different kinds of people. You know, many of us are still working, and we need allies to help us in our jobs figure out how to provide leadership, how to mobilize adaptability within our organizations, and how to listen more carefully. We need allies to provide extra sets of eyes and ears to help us figure out how to pace the adaptive work, how to sequence it, where to distribute responsibility, and how to help people then innovate, experiment, and figure things out on the fly as we're moving through this process together. But we also need confidants, not just allies. We need people who we can talk to, who we don't have to worry about what we're saying. We don't have to be clean machines. We don't have to have our act together. We can just talk freely. And when we feel like a mess, we can talk about what a mess we are. We need people like that too. And so I hope that you're using confidants, families, friends, and using Zoom to even make new connections. Of course, one of our hopes at the Kennedy School is that the alumni organization will provide another forum for you to reconnect with each other. And I hope over this weekend you will use that to rediscover relationships that you've neglected over the years, but that could be wonderful relationships with people who you can contact in the middle of the day or the middle of the night and say, hey, you know, can you give me a half hour to help me figure out what's going on, either personally or professionally? You always had an interesting point of view. Can you just, you know, be a sounding board for me? And our hope is, really, it's a deep hope that you'll use this network in order to do that. I know that one of our shared interest groups within the alumni group is for our leadership alumni, the people who've studied various leadership courses. It's called the adaptiveleadership.net network. And it is creating all sorts of vehicles, resources for people to continue learning and to continue supporting each other through this crisis and on into their careers, from the most personal level to the most organizational and political levels. And I would encourage you to join that shared interest group which you can find on our executive programs, at our alumni programs website. So that's another source of resilience, you know, each other. We need each other. If anything, this isolation is teaching us how much we need each other. And it seems to me now that we're all moving into a new phase, or some of us at least are moving into a second phase, sub-phase within this larger acute phase. Again, this acute phase we could call stabilizing the situation. Within that stabilizing the situation, we're moving from the acute phase of, can we even figure out how we're gonna, you know, eat and survive, to now how are we gonna make life work? You know, for some of you, it's about losing a job or losing an organization, or how are you gonna keep that organization afloat? How can you keep pumping air into the water wings to keep people from drowning? How can you do that within your families? You know, how can you do that within your support systems? And I think we're in that next phase now. What's the next level of adaptability we're going to need to sustain ourselves and stay afloat at the individual level and at the family level, and then also at the organizational level? And that's the next phase. And I think very much we need each other more than ever. Because it's very hard to figure out how to make it through, how to address these next sets of questions all alone. Another key source of resilience is to calm ourselves. I've been finding myself sometimes waking up in the middle of the night. Another way structure we've used to at least to sleep better is to put all the electronics out of the room, so that if I wake up in the middle of the night, I can't reach out and look at my phone or my iPad and get reconnected into work streams or the news. And that's been really great, because now when I wake up in the middle of the night, I've got nothing to turn to except a watch, and I feel bored. And that's good. I've got to figure out how to calm myself, how to quiet my brain, you know, and that's now its own kind of learning challenge for me. I've got to develop the capacity to quiet myself and calm myself. And I think then many traditions have practices for resilience to calm ourselves in the midst of high stressed moments, to be able to hear ourselves think, to quiet our minds. And so I would encourage you to explore various kinds of meditative practices, various kinds of exercise practices like yoga, various kinds of prayer practices to quiet yourselves, to calm yourselves, to give yourselves an anchor into a transcendent location where you can hear all the noise go through you, but not attach, where you can let it pass, the emotions, the thoughts, and to begin again, as they would say in the Buddhist tradition. And each of our traditions have those kinds of practices to center and calm ourselves. And I'd encourage all of you to tap into your own traditions for those practices to calm yourself during these times. I deeply believe we're going to need them. And we're going to need them more and more and more because, again, I think the idea that we're going to be able to return our lives to normal is primarily an illusion. I don't see any way we're going to really be able to return to anything that's close to normal without reinfecting ourselves and starting the next wave of illness and death. So I think the smart thing to do is to prepare yourselves for the long haul. I hope I'm wrong. I really, really hope I'm wrong, that people will come up with ways to normalize life and to reduce the risk even before there's a treatment or vaccine. But I do think we need a contingency in case we cannot, in case those optimistic scenarios do not play out. And so I would really encourage you to, those of you who've never tried prayer or meditation or yoga or any of those other practices, to try it out. Maybe it's online learning how to play the ukulele or the guitar. Maybe it's learning how to play piano for the first time. Maybe it's taking a writing course and learning how to write poetry or narrative or journaling. I mean, I don't have a particular kind of practice to recommend, but I really do think we need practices to anchor ourselves, daily rituals, that almost become rituals to calm ourselves and help us, pull out from all of the anxious questions we're asking, and restore ourselves to a calmer location where we can hear ourselves think and begin to have faith again in ourselves and in the people around us. Fourth, I think we need to create spaces in our lives to feel the losses and to mourn the losses. The losses are really, really significant. For some people, of course, that's loss of life. It's loss of loved ones. For others, it's the loss of a business that they spent years building, with all sorts of care. I've often thought of restaurants owned by a family, and you can see how much work was placed in the location of each decoration and each kind of ornament and each kind of flower setting and the table settings, and how much care and deliberate and love. And then you see people working in that restaurant, family members, night and day, 7 days a week. And the losses then to people in every realm of our lives are real and severe. And even if we've been enormously lucky, and I would count myself as one of the enormously lucky ones, there are still very real losses for ourselves and certainly for people that we care deeply about. So I think the fourth thing I'd like to suggest is that you carve out a deliberate space to mourn losses, to let yourself feel the pain and the sadness, to let yourself feel even the moment of despair, because despair is okay. It's just another feeling of that's a normal response to a really significant loss where you feel powerless to do anything about. And I think we have to move through those dark nights of the soul. We have to move through those nights of despair. Certainly in leadership, one has to be able to hold despair and not lose faith. So we need both spaces to mourn the losses, and we also then need other spaces to restore our sense of faith in ourselves, in our sense of faith in humanity, faith in one another, to carry on, even when there's so much pain and loss all around us. I mean, thousands and thousands of people are dying every single day. But also we see so much around us, so many terrible examples of leadership. But we're also seeing positive examples. We're seeing both. We're seeing in this global adaptive challenge, massive levels of positive examples and negative examples. So those of us providing leadership to people, we have to balance the faith, the hope, and the despair. We have to balance both. You know, we do have to be able to feel the despair and the hopelessness that some people are feeling, because it is hopeless when you feel somebody who you love die, you know, in a matter of days or weeks, and you can't even be by their side. And at the same time, we need to be able to sustain the hope in life, the faith in life, for those of us who need to carry on and figure out how to make life work for ourselves, for our families, for the next generation, and the people in our communities or in our political communities who we care about. We need to be able to do both. We need to be able to hold all of that complexity for people. But you can't hold all of that complexity for people if you can't also hold it for yourself. So I hope that you will carve out structures and locations in your day where you can both experience mourning and loss, and where you can also be restored to faith through whatever practice that might be. Again, meditation, exercise, yoga, prayer, or taking guitar lessons on YouTube. Well, I think that's all I have to say, except once again, to really encourage you to use this time you're having together in this reunion to reconnect with each other, and to, you know, begin to make a list of some of the people you're going to see, you know, on your Zoom groups, of people that you want to reach out to again. And hopefully the alumni office will make it easy for you to find each other's email addresses, and so that you can reconnect, or Facebook pages, and reestablish connections with people all around the world that will help sustain you over the long term, and where you can help sustain each other over the long term. So, you know, may the force be with you, and I look forward to our next half hour of conversation.
Thank you, Ron, for those great remarks on leadership, personal resilience, and adaptability as a result of this crisis. Now we're going to open up to questions. Please note this webinar is being recorded and will be posted later online. To ask a question, we ask participants to use the raise hand function. Rachel Crinklaw will notify you when it's your turn to speak. You may experience a short lag time, so please be sure to take yourself off mute and turn your video on when prompted. We would appreciate if you could state your degree and year before you ask your question. And please remember that all questions must end in a question mark. I'd like to start things off by asking a pre-submitted question. Ron, what can we do to get on the balcony and look at adaptive challenges while in the midst of crisis management?
All of these anchoring mechanisms that I've described are means to get on the balcony. they are means to help you step back and reflect on what's happening and to learn from the current experience. The use of partners to debrief with, the calling on people and say, help me understand what's going on here. We need partners to be able to get on the balcony. We need sanctuaries to be able to get on the balcony and to hear ourselves think, to quiet the noise in our minds. And we need these daily practices, these structures to help ourselves get on the balcony. But another critical means of getting on the balcony is the use of a framework, because it's not enough to get on the balcony. One has to have a set of tools to answer the question, what am I seeing, around me? How do I interpret and make sense of the successful adaptations and the maladaptations of the systems, social systems I'm observing from the micro to the macro level? And in order to be on the balcony and capture lessons, one needs frameworks to analyze those patterns of behavior. Again, the patterns of adaptation and the patterns of maladaptation. And so I encourage you to dust off some of your notes or books from your student years and go back and revisit some of those frameworks to analyze change processes of innovation when necessity is the mother of invention, necessity is the mother of innovation. And this is a situation demanding a heck of a lot of innovation. So you could dust off those books and notes, or again, join the shared interest group on adaptive leadership to remind yourself to be part of a learning community, to refine the frameworks that we've developed so far, because of course all of our frameworks are at a frontier. And but I think the balcony, first you need a psychological mechanism to reflect in the midst of action. And I've given you some of those, again, partners, sanctuaries, daily practices, structure. But we also need frameworks. We need analytical frameworks to interpret. And so that when you're talking with a partner, you've got a shared language to try to make sense of what's really going on. What's productive work and what's work avoidance? What's a successful adaptation? What's an unsuccessful adaptation? How do I understand what's going on around me? Why is this politician doing this versus that? What might be the pressures on this person that we would need to interpret if we're going to counteract some of those maladaptive or unproductive behaviors? So I think we need frameworks and to get on the balcony, and I hope you can draw on the ones you've learned or the ones that you are already skilled at using. But I also encourage you to join our shared interest group to help us build and strengthen the frameworks we have, and certainly to rekindle your memory, to reawaken your memory of how to apply our frameworks of analysis in order to make sense of this adaptive context in which we're living.
Thank you. Next question, Elias Freed.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Professor Heifetz, well, first
Yes.
of all, congratulations for 3 decades of excellent practical leadership work. My question is very basic. Obviously, this crisis has changed the world for good or for bad. What would you say would be the key characteristics of the leadership of the post-next era or the post-new normal era be that is different from leadership nowadays? 3 characteristics.
Well, it's difficult to predict. It depends on how this crisis plays out. In some countries, it's playing out to strengthen the hand of authoritarian regimes. So then the challenge post-crisis will be, how do we renew democratic processes so that you have societies that are less vulnerable to charlatans with easy answers, who prey on people's anxiety for easy answers and end up not actually being able to deliver progress for their own people. We have, certainly from recent history, major cases of charlatans who preyed on people's pain and anxiety and gained and centralized political authority and political power and created an authoritarian regime. And it's and the challenge of persuading people that they've been conned when they've put their hopes in somebody is a very difficult challenge. I'm seeing that in the United States because I think 30 to 40% of the American public have been conned to believe that this man actually cares about them when I don't think he does. And I think most of his policies haven't protected the people who are suffering most from inequity. It's benefited traditional sources of wealth in our society. So for those societies where authoritarianism has been strengthened, it's going to be a major piece of leadership work to begin to unravel and wean people from that dependency and to renew a sense that the real progress required on the major adaptive challenges facing an economy, a country, required distributed responsibility. That no government is going to be able to solve the problems of economic diversity. Economic diversity requires the diversification of an economy requires a lot of entrepreneurial activity distributed throughout a population. That's going to require parents to teach their children differently, schools to be more effective in training people to have the education they're going to need to generate entrepreneurial activity, and so forth, and so forth. So the renewal of collective capacity is at the heart of adaptive leadership. That is leadership to promote the adaptability of a community. And dependency on authority is really a problem because it promotes the illusion that you don't need collective responsibility. You don't need distributed adaptability or distributed innovation or distributed initiative in order to make progress on our major problems. It makes the classic mistake of treating adaptive challenges as if they were technical problems for which all you need is the expert with the right solution to fix. And I think authoritarian regimes prey on people's deep yearning that these adaptive challenges could be treated like a technical problem for which all we need is the right savior to come along with a magical brilliance to fix. So we're going to need to have to unravel those dependencies that have been generated. Second, I think that in some countries, people will have had a shared experience and it will strengthen collective community processes. It will strengthen the lateral bonds of cohesion between peoples and rather than breaking those bonds. And I think in some societies, you're going to get a strengthening of the collective adaptive capacity of a society as civil society becomes stronger, as local governments become stronger, as families figure out how to take more responsibility for their own children's education, because now they have to, because teachers can't do the job to which parents have farmed out their children, by habit. Now parents are going to have to step up and do that job. And now schools are going to have to figure out, how can we teach parents to do the teaching job? And we're going to develop new adaptations, new capacity. Parents are going to develop new capacity. Instead of going crazy, and committing suicide because they don't know what to do with these kids, they're going to have to figure out how to how to manage home and life all at the same time under one roof. And that includes teaching their children. Now, some parents are literate. So they're going to in order to do the job of teaching their children, they're going to have to be learners themselves. So we're going to need to develop new capacities. So, some of our societies will begin to develop those capacities, some of our communities, others will not. we're going to see in this a widely distributed variance, a lot of variability, where even within one province or one state or one region, some communities and neighborhoods will come up with successful adaptations to build local capacity, and others will fall into a deep despair of dysfunction, where people will be fighting with each other, where you'll get people selfishly protecting their own peace, but collectively starving. There's one in Dante, the great Italian poet, wrote a trilogy on the Inferno, and then Purgatory, and then Paradise. And one of the visions of the Inferno, one of the visions of hell, beautiful depiction of hell by Dante, was a banquet hall in which there was a long table and people sitting around this long table. And the table was filled with food, every kind of food you could ever dream of wanting to eat. And yet, when you looked carefully at the banquet table, the people around the table were starving. They were emaciated. And in the Inferno, the traveler also then got to go to paradise. And in paradise, he saw the very same table with people sitting around the same table filled with food, but the people weren't starving. The people were filled with food. Their bodies were healthy and they were laughing. And so the observer was challenged. What do you see different? What's different between hell and paradise? What's different between the Inferno and Paradiso? And the difference was, in both places, human beings, people, had very short upper arms and very, very long forearms. So long that you could not put a fork or spoon in your mouth. You could reach out and get the food, but you couldn't put it in your mouth because your arm was too long. Okay. Now in the Inferno, people were starving because they kept trying to feed themselves. But in paradise, people fed the person next to them. And everybody fed the person next to them. So there will be some communities where people develop collective capacity to diminish the number of families and people and businesses that drowned. Some people are going to drown. Some people are dying. Some businesses are going to go under. But some communities will diminish those losses by finding ways to develop collective capacity. But other communities will not. They're going to starve together, and we will have a lot to learn in this crisis from those communities that developed this collective capacity and those communities that did not. And so post-crisis, we'll need to draw on those lessons to address all the other kinds of issues we need to address. Poverty, education, the distribution of wealth, family planning, domestic violence. We're going to see an increased number of cases of domestic violence because men are home with women, and the men in their frustrations are going to beat up their women or beat up their children. We're going to see increased numbers of suicide. But we're also going to see some successful cases where people learned how to buffer and manage their stresses so that they did not take out their violent impulses on the people they love. Now, we're going to need to capture those lessons of adaptability and failed adaptability to address post-crisis how to continue working the pandemic of violence against women that we see in every society around the world, for example, and so forth and so forth for every one of our major adaptive challenges. I don't think I've answered you in a very neat way, but I hope you feel that I've provided some kind of response.
Very good, thank you very much. And I forgot to say I'm mid-career Mason Fellow 1995, celebrating our 25th anniversary from the distance.
Congratulations, Elias. Great to see you. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a lot of hands raised, so we'll do our best to get through all the questions. Next
Yes.
question comes from Rick Bowerly.
Hello, Ron.
Hey, Rick, good to see you.
MPA 1995.
Great.
Thank you.
Welcome back.
Thank you for providing another balcony. I will just say I've tried to find my way to the balcony as much as I can over the last 25 years. So thank you.
Yes.
Question, you mentioned work avoidance in your opening comments, and you've shared a little more about that. I wonder if you can just help refresh for the work avoidance I should be looking for in myself or
Yes.
my colleagues or my organization during times when we have all these stresses or pressures on us.
That's a really, really good question. I think the crisis is going to expand our sort of diagnostic toolkit of being able to notice and see different forms that work avoidance takes, because we're seeing many, many, many different forms of it. Again, from the most micro personal level to the most macro. And we're also seeing very productive kinds of work, examples of that too. So, as you might recall, Rick, from 25 years ago, the two basic categories of work avoidance patterns are distractions of attention. People feel better when they're not paying attention to the tough problem. And displacement of responsibility. People feel better if it's not my problem to solve. Okay, so in this crisis, we're all being forced, because the virus is demanding it, and then our politicians and scientists are telling us that we have to change the way we're behaving. And we have to own this problem. We can't just blame somebody else. We can't just externalize the enemy. We can't just, blame the government or blame the scientists that they didn't get it right. We might be angry, like in the United States, that certain capacities that have been developed to deal with pandemics were atrophied and were dismantled. But that still wouldn't solve the problem entirely. It would diminish the death rate, but it wouldn't solve the problem that each of us at our individual lives need to shelter in place, wear masks when we go outside, be enormously careful at not infecting ourselves and not infecting other people. There's nothing the government could have been doing in preparation for this that would prevent the need for distributed change on each of our parts and personal responsibility. And then each business taking responsibility and so forth. So when you begin to see people go beyond the normal moaning and groaning and complaining about how they out there aren't doing the right thing, where that becomes not just kind of the natural complaining, that's also healthy. It's also part of our analysis of what's going on in the world. We want to participate in the world. We need to observe what's successful and what's unsuccessful. But when that becomes the dominant preoccupation, and we're not spending any time talking about what we're going to do, how we're going to help our own family, how we're going to manage our own stress, how we're going to take responsibility. When the responsibility doesn't return back home, When it only stays outward someplace else, then it becomes work avoidance. Because then we're avoiding our work, the job that is ours to do, to face into this adaptive challenge and build new capacity for ourselves, for our families, for our children, for our, friends, for our neighbors, for you, for your classmates, and then politically and organizationally in whichever context you're working. So that would be the bottom line telltale sign. When you see that 99% of the responsibility is going outward rather than staying at home, or 90%. I don't mind if 40% stays outward, because we do need to analyze what's going wrong in the world around us, because there is responsibility out there, to locate. But a good measure of it needs to be located here. And same thing with attention. If we're spending all of our time looking at the TV news and not any time, looking at ourselves, at the people we're living with, at our friends, at our families, saying, okay, how are we going to do this next phase? How are we going to keep from going crazy? What are we going to do with our kids? We can't just park them in front of the television set all day long. We're going to have to build new capacity to multitask and figure this out and keep them in a learning process. And by the way, this might last another year. What are we going to do? So we need to both bring attention and responsibility back home. When you see both of those leaving home, then you got to start worrying about work avoidance. You're welcome.
Thank you. Ron has graciously offered to stay past the hour to answer a few more questions. So next up is Jim Saylor.
Hi, Ron. This is Jim Saylor, MPP class of 1995. I was also at the fantastic Baltimore meeting of the Adaptive Leadership Network, which really reignited a lot of us. And we've been continuing to meet. So, our groups have continued to meet. It's great to see you.
Great. Thank you, Tim.
And great to see that you're well. You've referred a few times in this to the issue of we're in the midst of a crisis and we want to try to get on the balcony, learn what we can and so on and deploy them in the future. But it also seems to me that and I live in New York City, so in the United States, this is as tough as it gets. But while we're in the midst of this crisis, I don't think we've actually felt the real crisis for most people. Of course, many people have died, many people have gotten sick, but multiples, tens and hundreds of the people who have been directly affected are going to be indirectly affected by the economic dislocation, which is to come. And I'm wondering how I work in global development, which is going to be completely changed, I think, by all of this. And my question is, how can we, in the midst of what is a legitimate crisis right now, how can we try to prepare those in our organizations for the fact that even while we're dealing with this crisis, we've got a big change and big adaptive change to come, and we can't wait until the ER is cleared here in order to address that?
I guess I think of it as a process over time. You have to track people's attention capacity. That is, do they have the mind share? Can they devote 5%, 10%, or 30% of their attention to the challenges you were working on beforehand and the challenges you want to continue working on in terms of economic development or health development or social justice development, whatever area of development you're working on. And right now, I think we have to honor the fact that a significant percentage of people's attention is captured by the crisis, by the immediate moment. And and you can't ask them to just park it, and come back to the other issues and pay attention to those. But you might be able to do it a little. Like maybe right now, you can get 10% mind share and maybe a month from now, 20%, and maybe beyond that, 30%, and maybe then it'll go back down to 10%, depending on how the crisis continues to unfold. So I think at best, you would use the current crisis to capture lessons about adaptability and capacity building related to the crisis, the virus crisis, that then you would be able to apply as a heuristic, as a teaching moment, as a common experience, and say, look at what we were able to do on that. Now, this is very similar. So that when you do return to, where you're getting 40, 50% people's mind share, or even 30%, you can begin to say, what did we learn from the COVID-19 adaptive challenge and our adaptability? How can we apply it now to this challenge? So I would try to use it rather than see it as just a distraction. I want to get back to business as usual. Won't this end already? I would instead suggest milk it for all it's worth. Squeeze all the juice out of it that you can. There's so much to be learned because it's a common experience uniquely shared by everybody around the world. Everybody's trying to figure out what it means to shelter in place, how to keep schools going, how to keep their economy going, how to keep feeding their family. And getting people to step back and learn from that to then apply to those other developmental challenges, I think it becomes a rich schoolhouse for the future if we use it that way.
Thank you, Ron.
Pleasure. Good to see you again.
Thank you. Next question comes from Tessie Katsambas.
Hey,
Tessie.
Ron. Hi,
Great.
it's good to see you again.
Yes.
So I'm MPP 85.
35 years.
I know.
Congratulations. We're growing old together.
Yes, exactly. It's a good feeling, actually. So my question is about a feeling that you haven't talked about yet, and it's the feeling of guilt. I'm fortunate to be, I have a company of 120 people working like Jim in international development. And we were lucky to be in the online learning space and facilitation. So in fact, we're growing and we're helping many of our clients to reframe, and it's a very creative time. And the thing that I'm worried about is how do I manage the guilt that comes with creativity, laughter, some prosperity in the midst of this devastation? I mean, we're giving, we're trying to always think about the community, but there is this guilt. So what do we do?
I think that's a great question. Such a rich question. Well, I don't have too much time. So let me see if I can answer it, with 2 or 3 chapter headings. And each one has richness in it. The first is, we all got to count our blessings. And I think one means of counteracting the guilt is to count your blessings. And to affirm and acknowledge how lucky you are in countless ways. You happen to be born with a particular brain. You didn't earn that. You were born in a particular setting where certain people invested in you. Family, teachers, mentors, a coach. So most of us are, certainly everybody who ends up at Harvard, even for a year or two, has been enormously lucky. None of us really deserve, what we've achieved. Of course, we have worked hard and we have participated in our achievement, but we can't say that our achievement is 100% a product of our own work. Again, we didn't earn having a particular brain with its capacity, or having a particular family or socioeconomic status, or that we luckily stumbled upon a 7th grade teacher who fished us out and kept us from drowning and gave us hope to carry on and faith in ourselves. You know, we were incredibly lucky, each of us blessed in so many ways. And so I think each of us needs to count our blessings as a habit of life, rather than fall into the illusion that we've earned it entirely. And I think it's a form of personal and philosophical narcissism to say we've earned it. You know, philosophical in the sense that I think there are some political philosophies that they want to direct people to feel that your life is up to them, to develop their own sense of agency. I think that's critically important, but we can take it too far so that people begin to feel like I really did it all on my own. And where the sense that I've really accomplished something isn't just a source of proper and appropriate pride, but it also slides into an illusion of not being grateful for all the people that have really bailed you out and helped you out over time. So that's the first thing I'd say. There's a chapter heading called All of Us Having the Humility to Count Our Blessings. And then the second heading would be to investigate what the guilt is about in your family and historical tradition. Because guilt is a cultural phenomenon. You know, we learn to be guilty. It's part of the software that we internalize growing up from our families and from our culture, from our ethnicity, from our religious traditions. As we internalize an identity of this and that and this and that, as we internalize each of these identities, a member of this community, a member of this family, a member of this gender, a member of this religious group, a member of this historical tradition, part of the lines of code that we've internalized, if this, then that, if this, then that, are lines of code that speak to guilt. Don't take too much pride. You know, if you're luckier than somebody else, you know, there's a problem here. And it becomes really important, and this is kind of a big chapter, of beginning to identify who would you disappoint in your social surround, in your professional surround, and in your ancestry. In each of those big social identification levels of groupings, in each of those different buckets of identifications, who would you be disappointing if you were to stop feeling guilty? Because guilty is like a payment. You know, so who's expecting you to be guilty? And who would you disappoint if you stop being guilty? And to try to identify who those people are. They may be people in your professional life. They may be people in your social surround, your community, your friends, your family, your religious group. They may be people in your ancestry, in your traditions, that are tasking you with feeling guilty because you've been so comparatively lucky. So I would identify who are those voices. And then I'd begin to engage in a dialogue with them. You know, what do you want from me? Why do you want me to feel guilty? What is this line of code about? And to, in a sense, begin to renegotiate that loyalty or renegotiate those lines of code, that renegotiate with that source of identification and say, I honor and cherish 98% of your lines of code, but these two, this module called the guilt module, I really need to rewrite some of those lines of code because it's not helping me. It's not helping me count my blessings. It's not helping me be effective. It's not helping me celebrate other people. It's not helping me help other people learn how to, you know, celebrate and count their blessings and to rejoice in the fruits of their labor, which is so necessary in life that we rejoice in the fruits of our labor and not just keep tasking ourselves to look at what's undone yet. You know, we have to stay in life by taking pleasure in the good we've done. But if we have too harsh a guilt module that says you can't celebrate the fruits of your labor, you know, that's sort of taboo, then how good are we going to be at helping other people do that? So, you know, I think it's important the second chapter is to renegotiate those, to identify those loyalties, those identifications where you've learned to be guilty, and then to begin to engage in an internal dialogue with those voices. Maybe it's an external dialogue with actual people in your life. You know, maybe you go back home and take a history with your mother or your uncle or your grandfather and say, tell me about guilt. Where did this come from? How did I learn this? You know, how have you dealt with it in your life? You know, and you begin to understand where you come from, what you've internalized unwittingly, that once you begin to understand more, you can more deliberately then engage with and refashion those expectations, renegotiate those loyalties. Anyway, those are 2 chapters. And
Thank you.
I hope that begins to respond to your question.
It does. Thank you.
Last question comes from Charles Hutner.
Charles, hi.
Hey, Ron.
Good to see you.
It is so good to be able to see you and talk to you again. I can only say we were in I think your first class teaching in the MPA 85. And I will say, I just got off a telcon or I guess I should say a Zoom from, I think it was, I don't know, at least 35 or 40 people from our class. And I think your name came up at least once in almost everyone's conversation. You were an incredible inspiration to us, and everyone took something incredible away from your course. I mean, just to stand up there and not say anything for 30 minutes was enough to take us, change our lives. So a couple of things. I just want to thank you because I was almost killed off a couple of times in my career. Most of us are now, I'll say, approaching or over 70 now. So we're not, back into the workplace. And I'll say thank you for all you just said about the current crisis, but most of us are retired at this point. But a couple of things that specifically spoke to me, moving on from the crisis was, how to become a leader by questioning, asking the pertinent question, even if you don't have the authority. And maybe that's a helpful thing nowadays. And the second thing you said, which is stuck with me, or a number of things, but one of them is, kind of listen to the first word that comes up in a meeting as a way of kind of identifying what's behind, the hidden meaning of the meeting. I'd love for you to kind of update us. I mean, you've been important to all of us. How can you respond to what you've done for us and update us on your thoughts on these subjects?
By the fall of 1984, I had taught the course twice, in the fall of 83 and the spring of 84. And then, so if you're the class of 85, then you were the third round of people that I explored with. And as you know, I designed the courses around the students' own cases. And I did that because otherwise it'd be the blind leading the blind. I mean, what did I know as a young doctor and musician about leadership? But by designing the courses around your case and other people's cases, I began to develop theory and insights into people's cases. And because I've continued to do that now for 37 years, the theory has continued to evolve quite a lot. And I've tried to capture that in my books to some degree. But it has evolved quite a lot, both the diagnostic indicators to be able to begin to observe patterns of social behavior that are productive or unproductive, the ways of helping people distinguish self from role, to be able to get on the balcony and take things less personally, and being able to keep focused on what the conflict is really about rather than take it personally and now it's all about me. And then ways of thinking about strategy, of pacing, framing, sequencing, alliance building, breaking the challenge into smaller pieces over time. So, you know, there's many more moving parts to the framework of leadership practice, both the diagnostic side and the action side, that has continued to evolve over these years, you know, because I've continued to learn from you and your colleagues and the people who followed you over these years. So, you know, I hope you'll get a chance to, maybe you'll find it interesting to join the shared interest group or the leadership network and see, because there are a lot of resources online. Some are online courses, videotape, written resources, and certainly a lot of discussion groups of various kinds. We started in this crisis a Haven Sunday Cafe. And so every Sunday people are just meeting to share ideas and lessons. We just had a 3-day conference on what are the lessons to capture from this crisis for people to apply to leadership in other domains of their life. So there'll be a lot of ways to kind of bring yourself up to speed. I wish I could list all of the ways, all the different ways in which I've learned. There's so many, I wouldn't know where to begin. Although my response to Tessie just now about chapter 2, you know, how to do internal work, all of that is new material that emerged out of my January intensive course that I began to teach in 2001, January 2002. So I hope to see you in the network, and I hope that as you bring yourself up to speed on the things that I've continued to try to learn from colleagues, you'll tell me what seems interesting. Take care, stay well, stay healthy.
Thank you, Ron, and to all the alumni who joined today. We look forward to keeping you engaged in future months. Please visit our website for the most up-to-date school news and events. Stay healthy, everyone.
Take care. Thanks again. Thank you for having me, Karen.
Thank you.